All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached our final panel of day one of the U.S. Cyber Command Legal Conference. And just as we started strong and we kept the energy going, we're going to finish just as strong and even stronger. We have quite the distinguished panel to close out the day. And so no matter where you fall on the partnership spectrum, whether it's public, private, academia, international partners, we're all dealing with the topic of this next panel, which is law and policy challenges amidst global competition. So it's my distinct honor to introduce our moderator, Colonel Retired Carrie Cordero. He's currently the director of the Technology, Law, and Security Program at American University, Washington College of Law here in D.C. And he's also an adjunct professor of cyber and national security law and the law of armed conflict at American University, Washington College of Law. And close to our heart, he is a distinguished alum of the U.S. Cyber Command Legal Office. His final 5 years on active duty, he served as a staff judge advocate or the general counsel here at U.S. Cyber Command. So, sir, over to you.
Thank you for keeping that short. So before I launch into the panel proper, I mean, I've said this privately, but having been involved in this conference a time or two in the past, like, kudos to you and the team, Pete. Elevating it every time. This is pretty amazing. Now it's online and people are viewing, so you know there's somebody out there drawing a mustache on me out on some screen right now or something. That's great. And I'm going to use my laptop, different than other people with their hand notes, because I want to make sure that the Chinese are able to collect everything on me during this presentation. But we are very lucky. We'll come back to the title of the panel in a minute, but let me first introduce the great lineup of speakers that we have, starting at the far end, Carrie Cordero, Robert M. Gates, Senior Fellow and General Counsel at the Center for a New American Security at CNAS, also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown, and a frequent appearer on CNN as an analyst, so you may recognize her from seeing her on CNN from a time or two, but consistent across the panel, we have folks who have deep experience in both the private sector in different capacities and in government and public sector. So Carrie served many years, including as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Senior Associate General Counsel at the Office of ODNI, and Attorney Advisor at the U.S. Department of Justice. Has been working intel and national security law issues for a long time and brings a wealth of experience. Next, we have Ben Powell. Was able to get through the gate after a push or two, so thank you for fighting your way through that. Even with Air Force pedigree and a blue suit, they gave you a hard time. Ben is a partner and co-chair of cybersecurity and privacy practice at WilmerHale, of one of the most well-renowned and respected attorneys in the space of cybersecurity, national security law in the private sector for a number of years. But Ben was also the first, I believe, correct, general counsel at ODNI, helped stand up ODNI in the early days. And he also served as a special assistant to the president and associate White House counsel. He was an Air Force officer, as I mentioned, and did work at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Again, another with deep experience in the national security law space over time. So we get both hats to bring to this conversation, which is great. And then Alisa Starzak. I think the first time we met Alisa, I don't know whether it was when you were at DoD General Counsel, maybe we bumped into each other, but the Army TJAG now, Joe Berger, reached out to me when I was the SJ at Cyber Command and said, hey, can you come to me with a meeting with Army General Counsel, because he was the SJ at Army Cyber Command, and they were trying to do some reforce allocation or something, and he brought me into a knife fight that I lost. So, but anyway, that was a good introduction, Alisa, but we've made peace ever since. No, so she is the Vice President, Deputy Chief Legal Officer, and Global Head of Public Policy at Cloudflare, a company that most of you should recognize, a cloud connectivity company on a mission to help build a better internet. That's great. I like that. But as I mentioned previously, plenty of time in government as the 21st General Counsel of the Army, also at DoD General Counsel's office, worked on the Senate as well on the Hill. Yeah, so we are lucky to have this lineup to talk about a topic that, as we did our due diligence and got together yesterday to plan, I think we all realized we weren't sure what the topic is. So this should be good. Law and policy challenges amidst global competition. So we had a lot of ideas kicking around, and I think we'll be able to cover most, if not all of them. I will say, I'll give you a signal. We're not going to wait to the last 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Let's get a hot bench going today. Let's get interaction. I'll draw questions in earlier, hopefully. But part of it really was thinking through what did we mean by this. So this is like Pete really instituting mission command and giving me very general guidance, seize the initiative, et cetera. So we have wide latitude. But we know that we've been in the DoD circles and the national security circles for the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years. The terminology pivots and great power competition, move to strategic competition in the current administration. That could be the setting of this discussion. It's something, I think, broader. We talked yesterday, global competition. So I guess my first question for each of you, and we can start with Alisa and work our way down. What do you take to be this topic and the challenges that are presented currently amidst global competition?
So we did have a very lively conversation about global competition. And I think Gary started with me probably because my view is sort of a military one. I'm actually involved in the National Defense Strategy Commission. And so we've been talking a lot about what competition means and what it actually looks like globally, and particularly conflict with China potentially down the road, what that would mean. So I kind of turned to that one. And I think from a practical standpoint, when we think about that, one of the pieces that comes from a private sector standpoint is really thinking about the role of technology in that conflict. And when you get into the world of policy and legal challenges, what is the barrier? If we want to harness private industry and private technology companies in particular in a bigger, all of nation fight or all of society fight, if that's where we end up going, what does that look like and what are the barriers that we see? So that was how I saw the conversation about what global competition is. And we can talk a lot about that because there are a lot of barriers right now. There are barriers inside the U.S. about when we have conflicting ideas about what regulations are going to do and what that means for industry and what the effect is. There are international barriers when we have conflicts in regulatory environments and different views and lack of coordination. And then just generally a lack of understanding between industry and government in general. So I think there's a lot we can talk about today. I'm actually going to keep it short, at least from an initial comment, because I tend to think, particularly at the end of the day, the more we can have interaction, the better off you will all be, and the more awake you will all be at the end.
Hear, hear. Before I turn to you, Ben, I want to say I asked ChatGPT what the legal and policy challenges are. And ChatGPT told me there's just 2. I won't tell you which ones, but it just said 2. But Ben had a very long list of challenges, which confirmed for me that ChatGPT is kind of stupid because Ben's really smart. So I defer to Ben. Ben, what do you think the challenges are and how we frame this question or this panel?
So I'm smarter than a machine that is prone to psychopathic hallucinations. So thank you, Gary, for that compliment here at the end of the day. Recalls of some of our past interactions. I first met Alisa at an intelligence oversight hearing. None of you will remember, but there were a few controversies after 9/11 related to signals intelligence, related to a variety of intelligence operations around the world, but maybe that predated a number of people and you haven't heard about any of that. But the first month I took over as DNI General Counsel, I'll just tell one more story. I think we testified, General Hayden and I believe we testified for 12 hours straight between the House and Senate. So that was my first month introduction to the job, and I was testifying about a number of programs which I had nothing to do with and had to come up to speed and testify extensively on. So it was quite a time of it, to put it mildly. But getting to the topic, and happy to take any questions on this, I think it's exactly what Alisa said, and we are also in many ways moving towards a more segmented world, and a world that frankly threatens the U.S. home field advantage that we have in IT and technology. That's going to be critical to both, great power competition and asymmetrical warfare. So when I look across the landscape, and we all live through the world about an internet of no boundaries and a boundaryless flow of data, of course, we've moved to a very different place right now, and the velocity of that segmentation is growing. So when you look at how long it took Europe to come up with their GDPR, their privacy law, many years, many struggles over that. They enacted their EU AI privacy law here, at light speed in 6 months. There's going to be more development for that. It has to go to the countries and those types of things. But you just look at this velocity that is happening. When you look at the requirements for data localization, the inefficiencies that creates, and frankly, the looming national security challenges that are in the background that come out of those laws. And of course, now many countries enacting both inbound investment regimes similar to our Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which now looks at things like data sets and other things, when it was traditionally many years ago really about what I would call core defense technologies. All across the board and all across the landscape, you see countries becoming more segmented when it comes to IT, when it comes to infrastructure, and of course, everyone is competing on artificial intelligence, and just what is that going to mean for the United States and these technologies that we need to stay in the forefront of. Some of these will be advantageous to us because some countries will essentially remove themselves from the competition with stringent localization. But in other places, really, it will hobble us to the extent that it will hurt our IT industry to compete on the global stage. So very much when I look at this, a segmented world that we're moving to and the challenges that that's going to bring.
Definitely some things to follow up on there. But Carrie?
So thank you, Gary. It's so nice to be with Alisa and Ben and Gary, of course, and thanks to StableCom for hosting me again today. It's amazing to return here after many years and being at some of the original conferences that Gary had first put together and see how this community has grown and how this conference has grown. So it's really an honor to be with you guys here today. So I think the common theme that you're going to hear from all of us today focuses on the issue of technology in particular. It's not the only issue of strategic competition or global competition, but it is a big one. And I think it is a common trend from both the government perspective and through the private sector perspective. It's certainly the issue that is one that me and my colleagues at the Center for New American Security are thinking about every single day, all the time, because it goes through all of our different regions of expertise and engagement. The way that that I might tee up in terms of thinking about sort of three different aspects of how the strategic competition is centered on the technology sector comes down to these. So one is thinking about policies that promote the development of the technology. So we have to continue to think about ways that our laws and our legal framework is facilitating the development of the technologies, particularly here in the United States. A number of my colleagues, both in our energy economics program and in our technology and national security program at CNS, have done work on the need for an industrial policy for the United States. And part of that centers on the fact that we haven't had that kind of policy, that it needs to take into account the technology aspects, and it needs to take into account how you develop those with some of our close international partners. So continuing to have policies that promote the development of those technologies. The second is then facilitating access for the national security community, for the defense community, facilitating access to those communities, to those technologies, excuse me. And I think we heard in one of the earlier panels issues regarding the difficulties in getting innovative technologies into the hands of those who are trying to compete the mission. What I would observe is that this is not just a defense, it's not just a cybercom issue, it's not just a Defense Department issue. I sit on the Homeland Security Advisory Council, and one of the reports that we did over the course of the last year was focused on the Homeland Security Technology and Innovation Network, and thinking about how to get the new technologies that are being developed by American companies, particularly from the startup community, into the hands of the Homeland Security operators. And what we quickly found was that the issues that they're dealing with in the Homeland Security community are very similar to issues that the Defense Department has been working through for many, many years. So getting the innovation into the hands of the agencies and mission-focused organizations that need them is a constant challenge on the government side. And then third area that I would tee up that I think all of us have thoughts about is then the need to protect information, data, both from the data perspective and users. And this is where I think we'll get into some of the issues that are top of mind in terms of those who are engaged in the cybersecurity mission, as well as some of the ancillary issues that are now in our information environment space.
So you use a phrase in there, the need for industrial policy. That, in some circles, is anathema, right? And that seems to be part of how things are shifting and changing, especially in the technology space, as you say, and recognition of vulnerabilities that we have at a national strategic level because of supply chain issues. You talk about chips. You talk about data issues and the development of AI, all these things. Where do you see this headed from a policy perspective? And that's for any and all of you, kind of re-embracing or rethinking about what is generally termed industrial policy, and maybe explain for the audience.
Sure. So what I'm thinking about is in terms of some of the work that my colleagues have done at CNAS, where the fact that we haven't had, obviously, it would be a major shift to move to that construct. However, there is a couple reports that I would sort of commend to the audience. One is called Lighting the Path, and one is called Rebuild, a Toolkit for a New American Industrial Policy. And the reason for it is it relates to some of the prior issues that we were discussing in the role of the private sector, which is that outside of a policy framework, companies, including those that are privately held, are going to get out in front of issues that are in conflict zones in the defense space. And the integration of some of the technology issues in particular, it's all just much more interconnected now. And so the absence of a policy framework, what you're then doing is you're leaving individual companies to engage in these world events, in these geopolitical events, in a way that perhaps they haven't before. So I'll start there, and hopefully that'll give us enough to...
I want to follow on that. I think it's worth actually thinking about the world that we're in now and how we ended up here. Because it actually goes into some of Ben's comments, and I think Carrie's as well, right? If you think about how the internet started, and I think there was one of the panels this morning kind of talked a little bit about it. The U.S. started the internet from a practical standpoint through DARPA. All of the things that came up because the U.S. had an idea of how things should get built. And a lot of the ideas that sort of come in from the internet standpoint are all U.S.-oriented, this idea of interconnected networks, the idea that we can all be connected, things can go across borders, big concepts. And the things that then led to, it's sort of interrelated with things like globalization, which then allowed for sort of diversity of supply chain across lots of different countries. And we're now in this period where people are starting to rethink those big ideas. And I think you're seeing the tension with things like industrial policy, which was always anathema because it was not consistent with that idea of big globalization and how do we think about this, big openness, interconnectedness, how do we work through that? And you're also seeing it in lots of other countries who are saying, hey, I'm worried about my own sovereignty. Go away, US. We don't want you. We want to localize our stuff. We don't want you to have access to it. And so you're seeing this tension between a lot of those pieces. I think from the private sector side, the thing that we worry about is that the U.S. puts pressure from the regulatory and policy side in a way that encourages that even more, that ultimately decreases the U.S. advantage. Because the thing that gave us that long-term path from a U.S. standpoint of interconnected networks and an internet and private industry that we're building for the world was a remarkable amount of power and access and just ability to control things. And I think as we start putting pressure on that and separating and saying, no, we don't want to be part of the world, we're going to take away that long-term influence. And so we have to think about that balance in pretty significant ways, because I think it will, it actually is kind of where we're moving, and we're kind of moving in fits and starts. No one really has quite figured that out yet.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit to be determined on where we go with industrial policy. Obviously, we have the CHIPS Act, which is a massive amount of funding that's supporting the development of semiconductor manufacturing here in a number of places in the United States, and we'll see where that goes. Beyond that, we don't have a lot of additional industrial policy things of the size of the CHIPS Act. What we do have, and probably many people are more familiar with it than I am in this room, but how much COVID supercharged the supply chain discussion, not just on what we learned about protective equipment that we never thought of, vaccine precursor chemicals and all of those types of things, and where things were really made in the world. We then had Ukraine, of course, adding, essentially turbocharging that when we discovered, wow, we didn't realize this depended on some small manufacturers in Missouri. We had no idea at the end of this long supply chain. So seeing where we go with those kinds of investments, and of course we're seeing that across the IT and electronics supply chain, and we see that all the time in what the United States is doing with investment reviews and how rigorous those have become, largely with very good reason, of course, right? Because we're looking at trying to see, are there hidden hands of adversaries where it's going to give them access in ways that are going to, endanger the national security of the country, or is it going to give them access to the supply chain in a way that we're going to become dependent? And frankly, I think it was a wake-up call to many people as a result of both COVID and what we've seen in Ukraine as we try to ramp up production and manufacturing and other things, just how difficult that is, and how, what Alisa had said, how interdependent we've come. And that seems to apply across the board, not just to, things in the COVID world, but very much in the IT infrastructure world, what we see when we see the concentration in Taiwan and what would happen there in a higher end conflict. And the fact of the matter is we're still very dependent for a number of very important components on people who may not have the U.S. best interests in heart or even be allies of the United States. So I think from an industrial policy and a military policy, we're going to have to continue to think through that and manage those relationships. Clearly, a complete cutoff would be very problematic. And so how we manage that has really been, I think, the question that everyone is grappling with.
Yeah, I mean, it's manifested in different ways. The discussions, the decoupling discussion regarding China, which I think is Pollyannish. I mean, at best, and I think to your point, you're talking about recoupling in a way. The decoupling is probably not possible. But with these interconnected touch points, you do have vulnerabilities. Somebody had a question this morning, I think, reaching back to the original sort of premises of the creation of the internet, to your earlier point, that there were a lot of, it was going to be a good for all, right? It ignored a lot of the potential harms that we've seen that are also involved and flow from that. And I was sifting around through some things last night, and I see an article around internet governance on a Georgia Tech website. It's a pretty good website. But, you know, is the United States becoming China, right? So to your point of segmentation and fragmentation, et cetera, and they were making points about CFIUS and other things. What if China were to do to U.S. companies? I think they're already doing it. But this all manifests in different ways, the same sort of recycling discussion. How do we manage these relationships? And I'm going to bring it to the theme of the conference, the power of partnerships. Well, part of those partnerships, as stressed in all sorts of strategic documents, is international partners and partnerships. How do we manage that in this amidst global competition?
Really good example in the panel earlier from the utility company talking about a partially owned Canadian company, because I think those of us in the national security space, there's very bright lines when it comes to adversary countries, and then there's pretty clear lines when it comes to our closest partners. But there might be a range of potential international partners that are in between. There's a big range that is between our clear adversaries and our very, very closest partners that we still need to be doing more to figure out how to work with them, partner with them, particularly in the global technology space, that are not in either of those two categories. And I think that's where sort of the modernization of some of the CFIUS related, the foreign investment conversation, those pieces come into play even more in terms of thinking about our global partnerships when it comes to those countries that are neither the very clear adversaries nor our very, very closest allies and partners.
I think from the role of a private company, I think people might be surprised to understand how much of our day-to-day on the policy and legal side has nothing to do with the U.S. or where the U.S. is in conflict. So the number of times we have to deal with data protection authorities in Europe because they're worried about the U.S. government accessing data, which should be something that we can solve. And thankfully, yes, U.S. data privacy framework, yes, fantastic. But the number of things like that, where really we're talking about people who are close allies, and yet we're still in conflict with them from the private company side because two governments haven't talked, feels really challenging. And it's really hard from a company standpoint to manage that relationship and say, no, don't worry about the U.S. No, we're not going to respond to the U.S. when they ask for something. That sort of puts companies in a really challenging position. But if you want to do business as a multinational company, you have to understand the role of those countries. And again, I'm talking about allies. I'm not talking about hostile countries. I'm talking about allies. And so understanding those partnerships and relationships where there are potentially conflicts and trying to work them out from the government side, I think is something that doesn't happen enough. And often, I think when we interact with the U.S. government, the number of people who don't process that there are other laws out there that apply to multinational companies is shocking, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations that we've had where people don't understand, why don't you just let us in your networks? Well, because that would cause us problems, right? I mean, the number of conversations that we have on that point, again, because of allies, is really significant. I will also say, I think that one of the things that we see is trying to figure out what is being advocated for in sort of a policy positioning standpoint. So if you have somebody who is sort of on the border, they're neither close ally, as Carrie said, but nor are they full adversary. What are you asking them to do from a legal standpoint? Are you, when they put a law in place on data localization or on restrictions around sovereignty, where's the U.S.? What is the U.S. saying? What is the position of the U.S.? How do you think about those roles? I think we often see the U.S. absent in those conversations, or in other conversations where the U.S. I think could play a much more significant role in sort of shaping global conversations and global norms.
Yeah, I would just say, when we talk about the competition and following on what Alisa said about not just our adversaries, but those allies and other related countries, there's everyone wants Silicon Valley. Everyone wants the dynamism and the innovation that the tech sector has produced in the United States and all of the things that it has done, across the board, what we've done in terms of cloud, what we're doing in terms of AI. Of course, everyone's talking about quantum and whatever the next thing is on the horizon. But it is interesting because a lot of those countries have taken a very heavy-handed regulatory approach or an exclusionary approach around data localization, trying to, in some cases, hobble American companies and make it more difficult to operate. We can have a whole separate panel on whether that simply reflects different values across different countries and where they place their emphasis on things like competition policy, privacy, and other things, or whether they're trying to protect local industries and create their own Silicon Valley. I have some personal views about, good luck with heavy-handed regulation somehow magically creating your own Silicon Valley. So we'll just see where that comes out. But I guess I'd just say good luck to some of those countries because I don't really see that innovation and dynamism being created. But I do see a lot of jobs for bureaucrats being created. So we'll just see where that competition policy goes in the next decade as we accelerate the innovations in the cyberspace world, in AI, in quantum, across the technological board, on networking, on data. So, there's just going to be a competition in these models. I don't know that the United States is going to join in that competition, and we certainly hope that we keep encouraging the innovation and the things that have, frankly, provided a tremendous home field advantage to the United States, including our defense industrial base, really, to the kinds of things that you're operating, the kinds of things that you're dealing with, of course, are just amazing. And a lot of that comes out of our tech sector at bottom in terms of producing the software and hardware that is the foundation for a lot of the incredible weapon systems that, frankly, the world wants right now, right? And is trying to get their hands on.
Yeah, I think it's with respect to the new EU AI Act, right? There's a category of social media platforms of a certain size. It's a Digital Services Act, yes. Markets Act, one of those many regulatory EU things.
Very, very busy.
Very busy. But if you look down the list of companies that they've identified as fitting in the category of being covered, I think like 80 to 90% of them are U.S. companies. If Stuart Baker were here, he'd probably be a little less restrained. I've heard him say this is just technological imperialism from Europe. But it is part of we were talking yesterday, I think behind all this, there is a very live discussion about, in strategic competition, shall we say, ideological competition. Where are we with all of this, and who's agitating to bring forth their own version of norms in internet governance, in the space of content moderation, which fits underneath that. You look at Russia, I mentioned yesterday, in the first committee of the UN pushing for a cybercrime convention, which, when you start peeling it away, is essentially trying to define a whole bunch of information-based activity as criminal because it's being done on the internet. Therefore, it's cybercrime. And we can imagine whose ends that serve. How do we do a better job of partnering internationally to pierce through this? And we would think that the Europeans would be our best partners. And yet they're not necessarily our best partners. And China, who we could say is a divine adversary, we have entanglements that are also complicating how we approach this.
So I'm actually going to start on some of the EU things because I think they reflect a little bit about what's happening in the US as well. So the Digital Markets Act is essentially competition related. And if you look at what's happening in the US on competition policy, it's actually not that different. There is some of the same incentives that are pushing the Europeans are also pushing US policy in different areas. I think the challenge, honestly, from a regulatory standpoint, is that there are lots of different interests, and we see this across the board. Even in the U.S., you have lots of different things pushing different ways from a policy standpoint. So it's not all in one direction. It's not all. We're not all in the strategic competition. There are lots of other interests at play, and so how do you put those together into a coherent policy that does reflect the environment that we're in, and that sort of anticipates the longer-term goals that we're trying to find? It's really hard, is just the bottom line. And digital policy is hard. I think the thing that's happening on the international stage, to your point about allies, so again, going back to the foundation of the internet, one of the governance structures of the internet are multi-stakeholder, and that sounds really weird in a military environment, but the idea that all sorts of people come together and make decisions about how the internet is run, that actually is what happens, right? From a practical standpoint, that's how protocols work. That's why we have some of the ways that we have now for how those things operate. Right now, in the international environment, those things are being reconsidered. We're at a point where some of those internet governance questions are coming up, and of course, that's opportunity for countries that may want to rethink those models. And so the challenge, I think, when you have a very complicated policy environment and regulatory environment, and you have lots of different goals from a single government, is that it's very hard to figure out what your policy position is when you get into those conversations. So when you're talking about something like the Global Digital Compact, right, which is currently under negotiation, or the Cybercrime Convention, what are we trying to do as a U.S. government? I think those are, again, we don't always have one voice, and that means if we don't have one voice, how do we rally our allies around the same set of principles? It's really hard.
I guess one way I would think about this is that, from my perspective, one of the challenges is that the United States still has not been able to settle on an agreed upon way that we categorize the technology companies, the technology platforms in particular, in a legal framework. And what I mean by that is, so there's one theory out there that some of the technology platforms basically function like utilities. And you can make that argument when you think about just the way that we need to use them on a daily basis. I mean, there's no aspect of life that you can go through from morning until night that in some way doesn't rely, whether it's at work, at home, your social things, the stuff you do with your kids, everything. There's no aspect of our life that doesn't rely on the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure and the digital infrastructure. So from that perspective, it sort of sounds utility-like. And then there's other arguments out there that say, well, no, particularly when it comes to communications platforms, they're performing a function that's more like a news organization. And so we have like these different old ways of thinking about different industries, and the way that the technology sector has evolved is just simply something different. And when I say the United States' lack of ability to sort of come up with a new framework that actually fits and isn't trying to fit these companies into an old legal framework that isn't applicable to the way that they conduct their work and the way that they operate in our lives, has then left us having to respond and be reactive to, for example, what the Europeans have done, where they said, okay, you're not going to create a framework, you're not going to put any regulations in place, then we're going to do it and we're going to impose it on you. And that has placed U.S. industry in a really difficult position.
Well, and to some degree, in very different, with very different approaches. If we think content moderation, for example, and Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act here is almost entirely the opposite of what we see happening in Europe now, and their willingness to sort of step in and place these requirements on social media platforms and others for content moderation. So it is challenging to think about how we get on common footing. So as companies in the private sector, I remember talking to I think it was Kristen Goodwin at Microsoft several years back, and similar conversation on the sidebar, and it was, you have to understand that, X percentage of our customer base is outside the United States, which puts a lot of pressure even on the U.S. companies. And if you're feeling that the U.S. government is not engaging, I don't know, do we have anybody from state here? Oh, hello. So they may have a different sense of whether we're engaging, but what's the level of interaction between companies and the government to convey these concerns and say, how can we get on the same page? And oh, by the way, does the company really want to be on the same page as the U.S. government because of the competing interests that the companies have?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of engagement. The question is really excuse me, really is the U.S. able to engage and influence it? So obviously a lot of concern, I think, in the U.S. about these issues, a lot of engagement, but Alisa will have a little bit, be interested in Alisa's perspective, but I think for a lot of companies, they're somewhat on their own in engaging in Europe and other places. Yes, the U.S. is able to support it, but I think it's not the power of the voice that it once was.
I think some of the challenges are it's not always clear what the U.S. message is, and I think that's from the government perspective, that's a little bit of an interagency coordination problem. When you're looking at it from the private sector side, this is going to be, again, kind of anathema to the military side of the world, but private companies look at it and say, they pulled out of WTO, what? And all of these messages about the interconnected trade and globalization, why would they do that? We had these great messages in APAC or in Asia Pacific. What does this look like for us? And so you have this lack of understanding, I think, from a company side about that the U.S. the U.S. government isn't a monolith, and you have a lot of different voices and a lot of different influences. But the company doesn't see that; they just see that the U.S. isn't sort of supporting their commercial interests or supporting them as businesses, and that raises challenges, I think, longer term. I think for folks in companies who have been in government, you can kind of see what's happening. You can try to explain it, but I think it's still hard to understand. If you're at a large company, we're not a huge company, we're a small company, but if you're at a large company and you're looking out and saying, why isn't the government supporting me in the competition world? Why don't they want me to stay together because I am a force against in the global competition, right? And I think that's confusing to a lot of people. But again, that's that reflection of a lot of different values that sort of get swept in. But I think that it's the interagency. It's again kind of an interagency problem. I would not blame a single actor in the U.S. government. I think that we don't always have clear messaging across different agencies.
We're not always synchronized across the interagency? What?
I know you're shocked. Shocked. What? Everyone in the room is shocked.
Okay, so I want to scan for questions from the audience. I think you should all be thinking, too, a little bit. We have a lot of people in uniform in the room. That's our primary audience here. I can't talk to who's watching from the outside, from what countries. But certainly, why does some of this matter? You're in your fighting position, looking over the edge of your foxhole. Why does this broader discussion matter to DOD or from a national security perspective? You might think about that. I could put it to the panelists because no one's raising their hands with questions.
I'll just say, following on Alisa's point, we recoil as a government from having national champions, right? We don't have a national champion, unlike some other countries who very much promote a certain area. So that, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, but it can affect us in terms of that international discussion, particularly when you have countries that look and say, time and time again, the power of American innovation, American technology, kind of the freedom to innovate that the U.S. has encouraged is just for some of those countries, they speak a very different language, and particularly today in the world of privacy and other things that you're seeing, as they kind of, for each new technology, are kind of racing ahead to regulate it. Right, our traditional model has been, let us see what develops here, and then try to be a little bit slower and smarter, hopefully, about regulation. And so right now you're seeing in Europe and other countries a kind of like a new technology. Let's race to regulate it because we missed the boat on the last technology. As you can tell, I'm a little bit skeptical of that approach. And it results, I think, in some cases of some companies saying we're simply not going to operate in that country until we get a clearer regulatory framework. We'll see. That may, in some cases, redound to our benefit, frankly, from a technological superiority standpoint, to the extent countries cut them off from that innovation. But we're going to see what happens.
So how do you see? Right, obviously there is that tension between the push for innovation, giving an environment, regulatory and otherwise, that favors innovation, et cetera. Are we in a little bit of a Thucydidean trap race? We're in an AI race with a primary competitor, and how do we manage that question? It's on everybody's plate these days, AI, and when's it taking over the world? But we're seeing more, certainly, in its executive order. It's not to the point of legislation like in Europe. But how do we manage that balance?
You need to ask questions, folks, because now we're talking about AI, and that's all your fault. So I will say, somebody gave an example at an event I was on a few weeks ago on AI that I thought was actually really interesting as we think about AI regulation. They talked about AI as a triangle, the sort of considerations. You have safety, security, and supremacy, all at different points of the triangle and all pulling in different directions. So, the reality to Gary's question is, as you think about AI, the more controls you add, the slower that you are going to go, of course. That's true from both the security side and the safety side, which are different, right? So thinking about the protection of an AI system just in general, what kind of controls do you put on it, and then thinking about the outputs on the safety side. I think the goal is to come up with not putting any of those at one point and saying this is absolutely, we need to go as fast as possible. Clearly, I think we've learned that sometimes you do want controls on technology. I think most companies have learned that too. But you then have to think about how you do that responsibly and still move the ball forward across all of them. But I thought that was a really kind of interesting model to think about those pieces as being in tension.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm wondering on this, like at a global context, like this global competition frame, there seems to almost be a global paradox where our global politics and our global reality are kind of different. And what do I mean by that? Where regionalism, nationalism, industrial policy are taking hold simultaneous to our economies and our people becoming more and more connected. And so as you advise with, and I'll make this more tangible, last year, we had our most productive trade year with China, simultaneous to probably our tensions being at their highest between our governments. So at that global level or advising through that seemingly paradox, how do you think through that, or what advice do you have for wrestling through that for us?
Start off a little bit. I mean, I think the answer is very different if we're thinking. I think part of it depends on, are we thinking about this from a U.S. government, from a defense standpoint, or are you thinking about it from the private sector standpoint? Because I think the answers to those are going to be very, very different. on the economic side of it, I mean, I think, and that's why there's a difficulty in terms of the tensions within U.S. policymaking right now, right? Because on one hand, we have a certain strand of our politics that is very aggressively treating China as an adversary and wants all U.S. policy from national security policy down to economic policy to be along that line. And on the other hand, we have the private sector or commercial side of things that has markets. And so that tension is continuing. And I don't know that we ever get to a place where one is going to outweigh the other. I think we're continuing to navigate that line unless there is some acute sort of military catalyst that then changes the balance.
Yeah, I mean, we're the country's trying to manage through it, right, on a category basis, right? So the new regulations around critical technology lists and other things and how that affects investment, and essentially the government saying that in these areas, right, on this list of technologies, on this locations, we're going to have a very heavy burden to allow you to invest in that kind of technology and those kinds of companies, and we're also going to restrict exports to you in that area, right? And that places a lot of tension on it because essentially their 5- and 10-year plan identifies, guess what, many of those critical technologies as what they are saying are their priorities. And at the same time, there's a lot of things not on that list. Where you continue to have interdependencies. And of course, we still have interdependencies for things on that list. And the government's from our perspective, in the private sector, the government's trying to manage through those interdependencies where, it's still on that critical technology list, but how do we manage through that, right? And kind of manage the tensions in the adversarial relationship. But as you said, it's still a very large relationship. It's still a very large trade flow. So we've tried to, it seems like now our policy is to look very much at those critical technologies and have an ever-lengthening list in ways that we didn't before, right? I mean, it's not new, right? Obviously things, submarine propeller technology and all the defense things that were on there. But now you look at that list and it's, data sets on more than 1 million Americans and things that are a long way away from anything you saw for the past 30 years. And when you look at, bio and other technologies. So it's exactly what you outlined. Right now, I think we're trying to manage through it on a categorization basis, right? It says if you're in these areas, it's going to be okay. And we want investment, and we want to continue the trade flows. But when you're getting into a lot of the things that you deal with here in terms of cyberspace, networking, high-end software, high-end hardware, high-end processing, we're going to have a more restrictive environment and, potentially some decoupling in those areas. But that's obviously not the most stable place to be. So we're going to continue to see these flare-ups. We're going to continue to be on this roller coaster, I think.
So I think we have the Grim Reaper standing up there ready to cut us off.
So that's why I'm here. Carrie, Ben, Alisa, Sir Gary, thank you so much for that incredibly insightful and wide-ranging conversation. Despite some initial questions about the original topic, I couldn't think of a better way to end day one. So before we deliver a raucous round of applause for our incredible panel, while I've got you, 3 quick announcements for tomorrow. So 1, we'll start back here tomorrow at 8:45 with administrative announcements. 2, we're going to start day 2 with the National Cyber Director, Mr. Harry Coker. And then 3, just a reminder about our no-host social tomorrow at 4:45 at the golf club, at the golf course. Final thing, please grab your trash, clean up your area, take it out. So with that, thank you for a wonderful day one to our streamers, to everyone here, and to our panel. Thank you so much.
The Cyber National Mission Force, or CNMF, is a joint command available to U.S. Cyber Command to respond to its toughest challenges. 2024 marks the 10-year anniversary of the CNMF. U.S. Cyber Command established CNMF in 2014, recognizing the need for a force agile enough to respond to any crisis at any time, composed of highly trained and qualified cyber operators drawn from across the services. Today, the CNMF is composed of 39 joint cyber teams organized across 6 task forces consisting of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardmen, Guardians, and NSA, Air Force, and DIA civilians. CNMF's mission is to plan, direct, and synchronize full-spectrum cyberspace operations to deter, disrupt, and, if necessary, defeat adversary cyber and malign influence actors. The CNMF conducts the full spectrum of cyberspace operations, consisting of offensive, defensive, and information operations. CNMF supports U.S. Cyber Command and national priorities such as election defense, counter-ransomware, global cybersecurity threat hunt operations, and other operations of national importance. CNMF works closely with other partners in the U.S. government. The CNMF routinely works with the FBI, DHS, NSA, and others to defend the nation. These partnerships are critical for this vital mission to defend the homeland. Each agency possesses differing authorities and capabilities. The ability to quickly share information, to leverage the proper authorities at the appropriate time, secures the nation and keeps our adversaries off guard, engaging them as far forward in cyberspace outside the United States. The CNMF is on the cutting edge of legal operations in the cyber domain. Since its inception, CNMF continues to drive the evolution of cyber operations. There has never been a better time to join the CNMF legal team. The Office of the Staff Judge Advocate, or OSJA, conducts the full range of legal operations, primarily focused on operational law. However, the office continues to provide advice across the legal disciplines. Individuals that join the CNMF OSJA must have a strong background in fiscal law, administrative law, international law, military justice, legal assistance, and of course, operational law. The CNMF needs attorneys that are creative enough to link the various authorities together and present creative solutions to our clients. As a plank holder in the CNMF OSJA, you will have an opportunity to advise on unique and novel issues that have a direct impact on national events. There are few other organizations in the government where you will be exposed to the type of issues that we see on a daily basis. If you are a motivated legal professional that can work independently with little guidance, we would love for you to apply to become a member of the Cyber National Mission Force.
Hi, I'm Colonel Pete Hayden, and I'm excited to speak with you as a part of the U.S. Cyber Command Legal Conference. Whether you are in person or virtual, your interest and participation are critical to solving some of the toughest and most important and interesting legal challenges facing our nation. Our commander, General Hawk, has set out his guiding priorities based on our competitive strengths: people, innovation, and partnerships. This conference will give us the opportunity to discuss exciting legal issues involving all of these priorities. But I want to reach out on something near and dear to all of our hearts here at Cyber Command. Our commander's very first priority is people. At every level, we want to attract and develop talented practitioners in diverse disciplines to the cyber enterprise, including legal professionals. Through participation in this week's events, you'll see exactly why that's so important to Cyber Command, to the services, and to the nation. The bottom line is this: we need you. Here's why we hope that you'll want to join our team. The Cyber Command enterprise is one of the very few places in which military attorneys routinely work side by side with partners from across the executive branch. They also get the rare opportunity to partner with the best and brightest throughout the joint force, to be a part of those high-functioning joint teams comprised of talented attorneys from across the services. Our council worked closely with the legislative office to help shape our congressional authorities. Whether drafting a legislative proposal, identifying policy and legal implications of an authorization act, or assisting with congressional testimony preparation. Our office is deeply engaged with our legislative liaisons and our legislative overseers. Our judge advocates, civilian attorneys, and paraprofessionals work closely with the private sector and academia to develop collaborative mechanisms to advance national security interests and defend against malicious cyber activity. Finally, U.S. Cyber Command attorneys regularly interface with our international partners on everything from military exchanges, exercises, information sharing, to coordinating plans and operations, furthering our interoperability and deepening relationships with our strategic partners. Here at United States Cyber Command, we build relationships across the services, industry, research community, academia, and the whole of government, and we do it to facilitate innovation and foster collaborative sharing platforms to advance our national security interests and defend against malicious cyber activity. Our partnership philosophy, it's baked into our statutory mission to direct, synchronize, and coordinate military cyberspace planning and operations to defend national interests in collaboration with domestic and international partners. Our practice is diverse. If you're a legal professional interested in national security law, we offer you opportunities you won't find anywhere else. Through your legal advice, Cyber Command will be better postured to defend Department of Defense information networks, to generate insights and options in defense of the nation and in support of other combatant commanders, and to ensure enduring mission advantage for the Department of Defense, the United States, and our allies and partners. If you're an administrative law or a criminal law practitioner, and you're listening in because you want to try something else, or you just find this work interesting, your analytic and advocacy skills are what we're looking for to solve emerging problems and make lasting change. If you're a contract or fiscal law wizard, please give us a call. National security law and acquisition law work hand in hand to enable our operators to spur innovation and maintain our technological primacy and build our enduring advantage as the finest fighting force in the world. We're in a war for talent, and we look forward to partnering with you in the unique, demanding, and highly rewarding practice of law at U.S. Cyber Command.